Highly sensitive people don't just feel more. Their brains actually process every sound, image, and message more deeply than everyone else's brain does. And that single difference might explain why so many of them quietly disappear from social media without ever announcing why. Scientists call this trait sensory processing sensitivity, or SPS, and it shows up in roughly 15 to 30% of people, depending on the study. It's not a disorder, it's not anxiety, and it's not shyness. It's simply a deeper way of taking in the world around you. Today we're breaking down 5 rare traits that explain why some highly sensitive people avoid social media completely, even when they love the people on it. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly what's happening inside their heads every single time they close the app. Before we get into the traits themselves, it helps to understand why this topic is so easy to get wrong on the internet. Plenty of videos treat every highly sensitive person as identical, but the research is clear that this trait shows up on a wide spectrum, not as an on-off switch. Some people score high on emotional depth but low on physical overstimulation, while others react strongly to noise and light but process social situations more easily. That's exactly why we're breaking this into 5 separate traits instead of one broad label, because each one can show up differently in different people. Let's start with the first trait, and it might be the most surprising one of all. Most people assume social media avoidance means someone is antisocial, but for highly sensitive people, the real problem is something happening inside their nervous system. Trait number 1 is that they get overstimulated by digital noise faster than almost anyone else around them. Research on sensory processing sensitivity shows that highly sensitive people have a much lower threshold for feeling overloaded by incoming stimulation. Think about what a single scroll through a feed actually contains: a family photo, a political argument, a war clip, a joke, and a grief post, all within 90 seconds. For a highly sensitive person, that isn't entertainment, it's an environment with no sensory off switch, and their brain keeps processing every piece of it. This isn't only about loud sounds or bright colors, it includes something researchers call cognitive overstimulation, where dozens of unfinished emotional inputs pile up in minutes. A highly sensitive person doesn't just see a sad post and move on, they can carry that image in their mind long after they've stopped scrolling. This shows up in real behavior: muting dozens of accounts, turning off every notification, and refusing to open the app first thing in the morning. Some describe social media as feeling too loud, even though nothing on the screen made an actual sound. The key insight here is that this isn't weakness, it's simply that more data gets in, and more of it keeps running in the background long after the phone is down. That single mechanism alone explains a huge chunk of quiet social media disappearances, and it's only the first of 5 traits. Notice that overstimulation here isn't about one bad app or one bad week. It's a baseline difference in how much gets registered by the nervous system. A highly sensitive person scrolling for 10 minutes might process the same emotional volume as someone else scrolling for an hour, and that gap adds up fast. That's why so many describe needing a full day of quiet just to recover from a single heavy news cycle they saw online. It also explains why short-form video feeds, with their rapid-fire cuts and constant novelty, tend to be avoided first, before anything else on the platform. Some highly sensitive people describe a very specific physical sensation after too much scrolling, a kind of mental static that lingers even with the phone put away. That static isn't dramatic or invented, it lines up with what sensory processing research calls a lower threshold for stimulation before the system feels flooded. Understanding that threshold is the key to understanding almost everything else on this list, because the next 4 traits all build directly on top of it. Here's a pattern almost nobody talks about, something that looks like caution from the outside, but is actually a completely different mental process underneath. Trait number 2 is that they think too deeply before posting, so silence starts to feel safer than exposure ever could. Most people post quickly, without dissecting every possible reading of their own sentence, but highly sensitive people often do the exact opposite. A simple caption can trigger an entire internal chain reaction. Is this too much? Will someone misread this? Am I creating an obligation I don't want? Sensory processing sensitivity research points to heightened awareness of subtleties, and on social media, those subtleties multiply into wording, emojis, and invisible audience collapse. Audience collapse means the same sentence gets read by a coworker, a stranger, a relative, and a critic, all through completely different lenses at once. For a highly sensitive person, that ambiguity isn't exciting, it's exhausting, because they can genuinely picture every single reaction before it happens. This produces a distinctive and recognizable pattern: posting rarely, drafting and deleting, disabling comments, or only sharing inside a tightly controlled close friends list. They're not rejecting connection itself. What they're actually rejecting is exposure without context, which feels like handing over control of their own words. And once you understand that, their silence online stops looking like distance and starts looking like a very specific kind of self-protection. This overprocessing isn't limited to big announcements either. Even a simple comment on a friend's photo can get rewritten 3 or 4 times before it's sent. Some highly sensitive people solve this by writing long, thoughtful captions in private notes apps, then never actually posting them anywhere at all. Others switch almost entirely to voice notes and private messages, where tone is clearer and the risk of being misread drops significantly. The underlying logic is consistent. If a highly sensitive person can't control how a message will land, they'd often rather not send it publicly at all. Now, here's something that goes far beyond simply caring about other people's feelings, and it changes how heavy an ordinary feed can feel. Trait number 3 is that they absorb other people's emotions, which makes an average scroll feel far heavier than it looks from the outside. Research links sensory processing sensitivity to stronger reactivity toward both negative and positive stimuli, and in some studies, greater neural responsiveness to emotional cues. Social media takes everyone else's unprocessed emotion and turns it into one continuous public stream, which is uniquely difficult for someone who doesn't compartmentalize easily. This isn't only about sadness either. Anger, envy, humiliation, and moral panic are just as contagious online, and highly sensitive people absorb all of it. A highly sensitive user can leave an app feeling completely drained, not because anything happened to them directly, but because they spent 40 minutes soaking in everyone else's nervous system. There's also a social pain angle worth knowing. Some theory suggests highly sensitive people may be especially vulnerable to rejection-related distress. On social media, that can mean overreading a delayed reply, noticing low engagement, or feeling the quiet sting of being seen but never answered. So when someone highly sensitive avoids social media, it's rarely because they don't care, it's often because they feel far too much of it at once. This emotional absorption doesn't switch off when the phone is put down either. It can keep running quietly in the background for hours afterward. Some describe replaying a stranger's bad news post later that night, feeling a version of that person's grief even though they've never met them. That's a very different experience from simply feeling sympathy. It's closer to picking up someone else's emotional weight and carrying it as if it were their own. Over time, many highly sensitive people learn to protect themselves by limiting exposure before the absorption even starts, rather than trying to manage it afterward. That's 3 traits down, and the next one explains why the entire culture of modern platforms can feel almost physically wrong to some people. Trait number 4 is an unusual allergic reaction to performative culture, comparison metrics, and the constant status games built into every platform. Social platforms are engineered to reward speed, certainty, self-promotion, and trend mimicry, all measured openly through likes, follows, views, and shares. Highly sensitive people often report discomfort in environments that feel inauthentic, overstimulating, conflict-driven, or socially strategic, and they sense the impression management layered underneath everything. Instead of finding that system motivating the way many users do, they experience it as exhausting because even intimacy starts to feel formatted into content. For them, the hidden cost of posting isn't just privacy loss, it's identity distortion, watching their real personality get reshaped to fit an algorithm. This helps explain why so many sensitive users prefer lurking, disappearing, or consuming long-form content that sits completely outside algorithmic feeds. Differential susceptibility research adds an important nuance here. Highly sensitive people tend to thrive in warm, low-noise spaces and struggle in chaotic, judgment-heavy ones. Mass platforms often contain both environments at once, but their design consistently amplifies the chaotic side far more than the calm one. They aren't rejecting information itself. What they're actually rejecting is the entire social architecture wrapped tightly around that information. This is why a highly sensitive person can happily watch a long, unedited documentary but feel drained after 5 minutes of the same topic on a trending feed. The difference isn't the content, it's the packaging. One format asks for quiet attention, while the other demands constant reaction, ranking, and comparison. Status games in particular tend to feel corrosive to them because visible metrics turn every post into a small, public measurement of worth. Even watching other people compete for likes can feel uncomfortable, since a highly sensitive person often senses the anxiety underneath the performance. And that brings us to the 5th and final trait, the one that reframes everything you've just heard into something surprisingly hopeful. Trait number 5 is a strong preference for depth, privacy, and controlled intimacy over the constant ambient connection social media promises. One of the biggest misconceptions about social media avoidance is assuming it always means total disconnection, but in most cases, it means selective connection instead. Highly sensitive people frequently prefer one deep conversation, one long voice note, or one small private group over 100 weak context public interactions. This lines up perfectly with the broader trait pattern. Subtleties matter to them, emotional tone matters, and overstimulation is something they actively manage. Private, slower communication lets them control more of those variables at once, while public social media strips that control away entirely. The result is someone who looks completely disengaged online while actually being deeply relational offline, or inside much smaller digital spaces. In practical terms, they might leave public platforms entirely, but stay fully active in messaging apps, newsletters, forums, or tightly moderated communities instead. They may consume thoughtfully without ever posting, return only for a specific purpose, and then leave again, and that's not inconsistency, it's environment matching. Think of it like choosing a quiet cafe over a crowded party. Both involve other people, but only one lets a highly sensitive person actually process the conversation. This preference often gets mistaken for aloofness by people who don't understand it, when the reality is closer to protecting a limited daily reserve of emotional bandwidth. Once that bandwidth is spent on one meaningful conversation, there's often little left over for 100 shallow ones on a public feed. That's not a flaw in their personality. It's simply a different, more selective way of allocating attention than most platforms are built to reward. It also explains why highly sensitive people so often keep small, tight friend groups instead of large networks, since depth requires far less constant maintenance than breadth does. A single trusted friend who understands their tone and context can meet more of their social needs than 50 acquaintances scattered across a public feed. That's the quiet trade many highly sensitive people make: fewer connections, but far deeper ones, and a feed built for breadth simply doesn't reward that choice. Now here's why this topic deserves to be taken seriously instead of dismissed as another internet personality trend. The credibility of everything we've covered depends on separating three layers that often get blurred together in casual conversation. First, sensory processing sensitivity is a genuinely researched trait, even though not every popular claim about highly sensitive people is equally well supported. Second, social media's effects on well-being are real but highly uneven across individuals, meaning average statistics often hide dramatic differences between specific people. Third, the exact behavior of avoiding social media because of high sensitivity is best understood as a plausible pattern, not a universal clinical rule. That distinction matters because critics argue the highly sensitive label gets overused or confused with introversion, anxiety, trauma responses, or autism spectrum traits. So let's be precise. Highly sensitive person is a popular term, sensory processing sensitivity is the research trait behind it, and social media avoidance is one possible downstream behavior. This matters because the label gets used loosely online, sometimes turned into an aesthetic identity rather than treated as a genuine trait with real research behind it. The strongest, most honest position is to stay precise about what's proven, what's plausible, and what's simply popular language borrowed from a much narrower scientific concept. None of the 5 traits we covered today claim to diagnose anyone. They're simply patterns that fit consistently with what sensory processing sensitivity research already shows. That's an important difference between a useful explanation and an overclaim, and it's exactly the line this video has tried to stay on. It's worth remembering that being highly sensitive is not the same as being introverted. An extroverted person can still find public feeds completely overstimulating. It's also not the same as social anxiety, because an HSP might avoid platforms due to overload and authenticity concerns rather than fear itself. And sensitivity isn't automatically autism, ADHD, or a sensory processing disorder either, even though lived experiences can sometimes overlap between them. Not every highly sensitive person avoids social media completely. Many genuinely enjoy platforms that are curated, slow-paced, visually calm, or community-based instead. And here's the part worth remembering most: sensitivity itself can be a genuine asset, not a limitation to manage around. The same person who avoids chaotic feeds often excels at noticing nuance, reading emotional subtext, creating thoughtful art, and forming unusually strong one-to-one bonds. This fits a broader idea from differential susceptibility research, that highly sensitive people are shaped more strongly by their environment, for better and for worse. Put a highly sensitive person in a warm, low-noise setting, and they often outperform less sensitive peers in empathy, creativity, and depth of relationships. Put that same person in a chaotic, judgment-heavy setting, and the very same trait that made them thrive elsewhere can leave them overwhelmed and withdrawn. That's the real story behind social media avoidance. It isn't a deficiency, it's a highly responsive system reacting exactly as the research would predict. So if a highly sensitive person seems to vanish from social media, the honest explanation usually isn't that they stopped caring about people. It's that they process digital stimulation, emotional spillover, and social ambiguity more deeply than most until the environment stops feeling like connection and starts feeling invasive. 5 traits, 1 pattern: overstimulation, vulnerability, overprocessing before self-expression, emotional absorption, discomfort with performative culture, and a preference for depth over digital noise. If you recognized even 2 of these traits in yourself or someone close to you, you're seeing a real research pattern, not an excuse or a weakness. It's also worth pointing out that these traits often appear together rather than in isolation, since overstimulation and emotional absorption tend to feed into each other. Someone who absorbs a stranger's grief post is also more likely to feel overstimulated by the next 10 posts that follow it in the same session. That compounding effect is often why a highly sensitive person's social media use looks like short, intense bursts followed by long, quiet withdrawals. Recognizing that pattern in yourself isn't a sign that something is wrong with you, it's simply a sign that your nervous system is doing exactly what the research predicts. Understanding this changes how you read someone's silence online, because sometimes the quietest people are processing the most, not the least. Next time someone close to you goes quiet on social media for weeks at a time, consider that it might not be about you at all. It could simply be their nervous system asking for a reset, the same way anyone's body eventually asks for rest after too much physical strain. Giving that person space, instead of pressuring them to post more, is often the single most supportive thing you can do for them. And if you're the highly sensitive one watching this, know that none of these 5 traits are things you need to fix or apologize for. They're simply the reason your quieter, slower, more selective way of connecting with people has always felt right, even when the whole internet was built the opposite way. There's another highly sensitive pattern we haven't touched on yet, one that shows up specifically in how these people handle criticism and feedback. That pattern explains why some highly sensitive people can handle enormous responsibility at work, yet completely shut down after one blunt comment online. Watch the next video on this channel to see exactly how that criticism sensitivity works, and why it's completely different from simply being thin-skinned.